Hello, Wake Up New Zealand. Carol Seiki speaking. Well, I see this with David Seymour and the principles thing around the treaty, etc. So I just want to remind people, because I keep on hearing this word Indigenous peoples. Now, that was not created by the treaty, by the way. Indigenous Peoples was created by a Tanzanian, and he was in the Tanzanian government for a very short time, but then left. He was a radical extremist, and his name was Pakapuni from Tanzania, of the Maasai tribe. And he started expanding this terminology. He coined this, the Indigenous Peoples. So anyhow, eventually that spread to George Manuel, who was the president of the Indian Canadian Brotherhood. So he again expanded it further. He later established the UN World Council of Indigenous Peoples. So George Manuel, with a Canadian delegation, with permission and collaboration of Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, they came to New Zealand in the early 1970s. I believe it was 1971, where they met with certain Maori politicians and a Maori entertainment troupe. And there was very serious discussions around this terminology that was coined by Pakapuni of Tanzania with Maori politicians to take that on board. So when George Manuel left New Zealand, he went on to speak at a university in the Northern Territories of Australia to what he called Indigenous people, which were Aborigines. So this is where that term came from. And as I say, it later led into the UN. And one of those early UN gatherings, there were some native peoples there, tribal peoples from around the world, and they had gathered there. And there was about 100 of them that protested against the terminology of being called or classified as Indigenous peoples, because they had never given their consent to be called that. So if you look at history itself, well, you look how the world has migrated, how like you had the Syrians, the reindeer tribesmen went into different areas, and they knew the different migration throughout the world. It was happening all the time. The only difference with New Zealand is that the colonials, the Queen Victoria, she didn't take New Zealand, just take it. We actually have a treaty, the TIRITI of Waitangi. And I'm talking about the one and only TIRITI of Waitangi, Maori, the original version, where it did not establish any partnership. It didn't create a partnership, and it didn't create principles either, and it did not create Indigenous peoples. This is all done by legislation. So in 1990, there was talk in Parliament as to Doug Graham. He was the treaty minister at the time, where Maori Council said that they were going to go to APEC countries to get support to have New Zealand ruled by the 1835 Declaration. And Doug Graham said, look, if you do that, forget the treaty claims, because there would be no treaty claims, because you wiped the founding document of the Treaty of Waitangi. You've abolished it. And that's what was happening at the time. So when the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights in 2007 was established at the UN, certain Maori politicians were already actually in there, and they were helping implement that. George Manuel actually was an implementer of that. So in 2007, Rosemary Banks was representing New Zealand at that the first adopting of the UNDRIP. And on behalf of the Labour government of New Zealand, she actually rejected it for many good reasons. One was that iwi, Maori, would have veto rights over everyone else, veto rights over parliamentary law, the constitution. It didn't fit in with the constitution. They would have the rights to all land and natural resources in New Zealand. And she said that's absolutely impossible, because much of that land is actually legally owned by others, and this was what was going on. So it was totally rejected by New Zealand. And at the time, Horomia, he was Minister of Maori Party. He was actually at the Beehive, and he actually agreed with Rosemary Banks and what was said. And he told the Maori Party to get their heads out the clouds and do something useful. And this is what happened. And you can find this in parliamentary speeches. When they come back online again, you can search through the archives, hopefully. So, yes, and this is what was happening. So then you had He Puapua that was actually commissioned and given the okay by the Ardern government to go ahead, and that was about changing the constitution of New Zealand to fit the UNDRIP. And at the time, 2007, those that signed that were saying, oh, look, this is just a document of aspiration and it has no legally binding content. And this is what was happening. So wake up, people. You know, this whole corruptness around the founding document of New Zealand and what's been happening. November last year, between the 21st and 23rd of November, Auckland University, Nani Mahuta opened the second day of this, and there were people from visitors from overseas, Canada, etc. And they were to give advice to New Zealand about the replacement of New Zealand's constitutional arrangements as to indoctrinating the UNDRIP into New Zealand's constitution. And this is what's been happening. And this is why the Maori Party is up in the air, is ropeable. So if you could see how certain members like of the Maori Party, the leaders, have been actually working alongside the National Iwi group to actually indoctrinate, to implement business with certain Indigenous corporations, companies. You could call them Indigenous Iwi elite, although you can take the word Indigenous out. All of this is corrupt, totally corrupt. So it's not about looking after everyday people who have a Maori heritage, have Maori blood in their veins, like 15%, but ignore 85%, which is European or other nations. What is it like to actually, I have to wonder, to have a fight within yourself? This 15% has Maori uh, heritage blood. There's 85%, maybe Celtic, maybe Welsh, maybe Irish, maybe Dutch, etc., etc., etc. How sad is that? So I look at my own background. I'm half English, half Irish. And I think to myself how the English got, they took Irish girls, women, over to the Americas as slaves, and they had to be obedient and comply to their Black African American masters who were also slaves. But what if I had that big fight in me that says, oh my God, half of me is Irish, half of me is English? Imagine a big fight. How would I have to deal with that? No, I celebrate both because I know the beauty of my Irish heritage and the beauty of my English heritage. And I celebrate being in New Zealand. I've been here 60 years. And my children, my grandchildren, and my great grandchildren born here. So, 3 generations of New Zealanders. And one of my children was born in England. So, out of this, I have 25 plus grandchildren, great grandchildren. And I celebrate that. That is like they have all sorts of bloods running through their veins. And hey, it's just a brightly lit, coloured Christmas tree every day of the year, isn't it? So, New Zealand, one nation, one people, one law, one for all. He iwi tahi tato. And I did learn a bit of English, a bit of I've learned some Irish and a bit of Maori as well. And the problem is, I went to university in my late 40s. I'd left school when I was 14. I took social policy, etc. And the problem is, when you learn a language and you don't practice it, you sure as hell lose it completely, don't you? So I can only say a few words now. But, you know, the Maori language is a very pretty language. Just their waitas, their songs are very pretty, and I love it. Fantastic Maori musicians, and ah, Billy T. James. Have I laughed my head off with Billy T. James? Just loved him. We need Billy T. James back again. Wake up, New Zealand.